Okay, welcome everybody to Is This It? Artificial Intelligence for Differential Diagnosis. I'm Thorne Sparkman, the Managing Director of the Slater Technology Fund. We're the most active venture fund here in Rhode Island. We've invested in over 130 different ventures. We're very inspired by dynamic founders attacking the toughest problems and trying to move the needle. And because of that orientation, it should come as absolutely no surprise to anyone that we're frequently partnered with Brown University at a variety of levels. And it's no different today, in fact. Most recently, the Slater Fund won a federal grant to partner with Brown University to launch Translational Ventures. And that's a fund focused on university research and researchers at the earliest stage. So we'll be leading the seed in ventures fostered with partners like Brown's Tech Transfer Office, the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship, the Brown Biomedical Innovations to Impact Fund, the Brown Angel Group, Rhode Island Bio, and others. But today, it's artificial intelligence for differential diagnosis. I want to introduce Megan Ranney. Hi, Megan. She's a practicing emergency physician and researcher, and she's focused on the intersection between digital health, violence prevention, and public health. She's the founding director of literally everything, including the Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health and the American Foundation for Firearm Injury Reduction in Medicine, among others. Megan has been a frequent talking expert on outlets like CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Fox News. She's also the creator of the popular mycovidrisk.app. So take it away, Megan.
Thank you, Thorne. It is a delight to be here and to be co-hosting this seminar series with Slater. So thank you for making this possible. So as Thorne described, I am the director of our Brown Lifespan Center for Digital Health, which, for those who've not been part of one of our seminars before, is a collaboration between Brown University and Lifespan Health System to quickly develop and disseminate effective digital health products that work to improve the health of patients and populations. And part of that work involves doing the science that serves as the basis for great digital health products. Part of that work is also about quickly creating partnerships that allow us to scale for impact and not wanting to see our amazing research sit behind Van Winkle gates or behind the doors of Rhode Island Hospital. And so that's where this seminar today is just so exciting to me. We have a cross-section of different panelists who come from within and outside of academia, all of whom are using science to truly transform the health of patients and populations in a variety of different ways using AI. And I think without taking away the fire from our panelists, any of us that are participating in this seminar have heard an awful lot of hype about AI and machine learning over the last months and years. There is some truth to that, but there is absolutely some hype. And today I'm excited to delve more deeply into some examples of where AI is used in a scientifically valid way to actually improve health, and some examples of where maybe we should look a little deeper. For those who are participating, you can use the Q&A function to type in questions. The structure of the day is that each panelist is going to give about a 5-minute overview of their work, their company or their research, depending on their perspective. And then we're going to have about a half an hour for a panel discussion with some questions that we developed in advance. We'll follow that with about a half an hour of audience-led Q&A. So your chance to get your question answered is to type it into that Q&A. So without further ado, because I know that we could make this a 6-hour thing, but it's Zoom, so we don't want to sit for longer than an hour and a half. I'm going to get us started. We are going to start today with Dr. Joe. So Jennifer Joe is someone who I've known for a long time. She works in the emergency department at the VA in Boston, is a serial entrepreneur, and is an absolute linchpin of the startup scene in Boston. It's been a joy to know her for a number of years, and I'm excited to welcome her today as Chief Medical Officer of Biocogniv. So Dr. Joe, take it away.
Hi, Megan, honored to be here, and just can't say how much I adore and respect you, Megan, as well, in terms of being a physician leader in the community and really driving medtech innovation, digital health, and leadership across the spectrum. Really remarkable. I think we forgot to say that you're also the founder of Get Us PPE, so definitely an advocate for physicians, patients, and everyone alike. So I've known Megan for a while. I've been working in the emergency room for the last 10 years. I'm here in the Boston area. I did my internal medicine training at Georgetown and my nephrology training at Mass General in Brigham. So that means I'm super dorky. If you've ever wondered what a nephrologist does, just think very, very dorky. Think like the dorkiest doctor you could ever imagine. And have been really lucky to be inspired by a great ecosystem and have been an entrepreneur. I founded two companies in 2013, sold them in 2018, integrated them in 2019, so that was a nice learning experience. And am excited to be now with Biocogniv, who's doing some very exciting work in artificial intelligence. We're a relatively new company, only in the last year, and I've only joined Biocogniv for the last 3 months. We are actively under FDA review to have our first diagnostic approved as a medical diagnostic. So I can't go into too much details, but we're excited to potentially be a first in this field for FDA regulatory approval.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Joe. I appreciate that. And we look forward to learning as much as you're able to share, as well as kind of the larger picture around the use of AI. Dr. Radinsky, I'll go to you next. So Dr. Radinsky, I met about a year ago at a conference in San Diego where she gave a presentation that I sat and went, oh my God, this woman is a computer scientist and actually understands emergency medicine. We got to know each other there, and then I've been delighted to get to learn more about her company over the last year, and I'm excited to welcome her today. She's the Chairwoman and Chief Technology Officer of Diagnostic Robotics, and also has an illustrious history of using predictive analytics to predict everything from race riots to political violence, to now using it for medicine, which I think may be a little more complicated than politics. So Dr. Radinsky, I'll let you give an introduction to yourself and Diagnostic Robotics.
Fair. Thank you so much. So quick background about myself. Most of my work till today, mostly academically, was how can we take everything humanity wrote since 1851 till today and build machine learning models that can read all of this information, identify patterns in history, and predict future events. I worked in Microsoft Research. We collaborated with the Gates Foundation, with the UN. We predicted the first cholera in Cuba in 130 years. We then predicted the Sudan rise in 2013. I then built a company that was doing similar things, but in economy, predicting economic events, which was acquired by eBay, and I've been eBay chief scientist from Israel for a few years. And then I met Professor Moshe Shoam and Jonathan Amir, and we decided to actually go and try to identify how can we build clinical triage systems. As you all know, till 2030, 3.8 billion people will not have access to primary care. So the waiting times right now inside the emergency departments, which are somewhere between 3 to 3.6 hours on average, are gonna be easily 8 hours very soon, as we already see in China. And what we started doing as a company, we obtained access to billions of claim data and medical records coming from Israel, Singapore, and the United States, from 14 different states. And we built machine learning models that are capable of reading those medical summaries, doing natural language processing, extracting answers to clinical triage systems, and then actually correlating them with machine learning models to what the doctor decided to do, which test the patient needs to be sent, how urgent they are, and actually providing those probabilities so physicians can build automated workflows. Today, we offer those from home, and not only when the patient has deteriorated into the emergency department. We work with 75% of the HMOs here in Israel. In the United States, we collaborate with some of the Blue plans, and also working in different prospective trials with Mayo Clinic, Maimonides. A lot of the things that we also started doing is looking at clinical triage in a wider form. So not only when a patient has a problem, trying to identify how to navigate them and prepare them for the doctor, but also trying to predict this even 6 months in advance. How can we look at the history of each patient and predict almost 6 months in advance that they're deteriorating so the primary care physician can be notified? Megan, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Radinsky. That was delightful and exciting, and I will say I can't wait to see the results of your work. Next, I'll go to Dr. Eickhoff, who I met, gosh, it's probably 3 years ago now, when we recruited him here to Brown. He is a faculty member within the Brown Center for Bioinformatics and the Department of Computer Science at Brown. He is a brilliant computer scientist, doing really cool work. I will never forget his chalk talk that he gave when we were recruiting him, looking at using natural language processing to do diagnostic predictions, and to really cull the literature in a way that was feasible and usable for clinicians. And so I'm really excited to have him talk today about his work, both as chief scientist and co-founder of a new company called Codiag, and how that intersects into his academic interests as well. Dr. Eickhoff.
Thank you, Megan. So it's great to be here. Like Kira, I'm a computer scientist by training, so that's where my roots are. I like to think about algorithms, about computability of things, and I like to think about loads and loads of data. And really within this world of, under this big umbrella of artificial intelligence, and within this world of machine learning, natural language processing, information retrieval, what I'm really excited about are what we call long tail problems. And what does that mean in plain English? Stuff, so we have a few events that are very frequent, that happen all the time, and then most things are pretty rare. And now machine learning really likes problems that are dogs versus cats. Right? So here's tens of thousands of images of dogs and cats, 50-50, and now just tell me which is which. So I can give you oodles and oodles of data to learn from, and then there are really only two outcomes. It's a dog or it's a cat, it's never a parrot. The kinds of problems that I really care about are the ones where we have parrots and lizards and all kinds of other things in these pictures, right, in text. So really the idea here is what happens if we have many, many possible classes, many possible outcomes, and how does that muddy the waters of our machine learning problem? And turns out they are pretty muddy at that point. And then aside from my academic interests, I'm working with a technology startup in Switzerland that's called Codiag. And there we try to bring exactly these techniques into the diagnostic process. What we try to do here is help patients and physicians speed up the diagnostic process and hopefully avoid unnecessary delays and also misdiagnoses. And very similar to what Kira described before, we as well try to scan the wealth of available textual information. So this could be the EHR, this could be textbooks, it could be published medical literature, draw all of this together and reason over the patient case and hopefully give you a probability ranked list of possible explanations for why this patient experiences complaints and why they show up with certain symptoms. At the moment, we have a Class 1 CE certified medical software for doing this. And we're working with a bunch of hospitals, both in Switzerland and Germany, as well as with rare disease advocacy groups. So Orphanet, for example, is using our software in the backend.
Thank you, Dr. Eickhoff. And last but far from least is Dr. Steingrimsson, who I have had the fortune of meeting only recently, but who is a brilliant part of our Brown University infrastructure. He sits within the Brown School of Public Health, apparently in normal times, leads a work group on deep learning, and has done some really innovative research over the past few years, both around AI for radiology and around some of the basic science around both the hope and hype underlying AI and how to use science to tease out the difference between the two. So Dr. Steingrimsson, I'm excited to have you introduce yourself and your work.
Yeah, thank you, Megan, and thank you to all the organizers. It's a very interesting panelist. I'm very much looking forward to hearing everyone's opinions. So yeah, I'm an assistant professor of biostatistics. I've been here for this my 4th year. Before that, I did my PhD at Cornell and then a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. And I am definitely not adventurous enough to form my own company. So I come from things from a different side than a lot of the other panelists, from a more traditional academic environment. A lot of my PhD work was related to machine learning and how you can sort of adjust machine learning algorithms to time to event data, especially when you have censoring, when some observations are sort of partially missing. You know they survived for a specific amount of time, but you don't know their exact time of event. So the question becomes, how can you adapt traditional machine learning algorithms like random forests or deep learning to that setting? Since coming to Brown, I've grown very interested in the question of sort of generalizability / transportability, meaning like how do both machine learning algorithms as well as sort of more traditional statistical estimators behave in a different population than was used to build the model. So say you build a model using data from the US, how would that model perform or behave, or how would it be needed to adjust if you wanted to apply it in say a different country, different geographic region, different healthcare system, and so on. So sort of what properties do translate, under what conditions, and so on. A lot of my sort of collaborative work has been in the areas of HIV as well as cancer screening. And sort of for the last couple of years, I've been very involved in a cancer consortium called Eickhoff, and mostly in the imaging component of that. So Eickhoff runs a lot of large clinical trials on sort of comparing different imaging modalities and therapeutic interventions and so on. So I think that naturally also leads to a wealth of imaging data, radiology data. So I have also become interested in how do you use information from images to actually do prediction and so on. So I think that pretty much summarizes this, and thank you again for organizing.
Terrific. Thank you, guys. I also have to say I love working with you all because you're all efficient in your introductions. I don't think I've ever had an intro actually go within the time allotted. So kudos to the four of you. All right. So with that, that gives us an extra few minutes for our panel discussion, which I'm excited about. So I'm going to start, we're going to try to balance this panel discussion between discussions about the science and discussions about the business side of things, knowing that this is kind of co-moderated by our Center for Digital Health and by the Slater Fund. We're really interested in both. And I hope that the discussion today will both inform those of you that are attending from the academic side and those of you that are attending from the business side, and hopefully create some collisions of ideas that will illuminate work on AI from both perspectives. So I'm gonna start actually by asking about the regulatory side of things. You guys have given an overview of how all of you are using AI in your business or in your research. And for those of you that are working, and I'm going to include Thorn in this as well from the Slater Fund, but for those of you that are working in the medical space, I'm interested in hearing about how you've handled the regulatory side, handled proof of validity, meeting FDA guidelines for software as a medical device, et cetera, and walking that line around the validity and accuracy of AI. I think Dr. Eickhoff, given that you've already mentioned that you have clearance, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll go to Dr. Joe and Dr. Radinsky and give Thorn a chance to weigh in as well.
Sure, great. So most of our insights really that I'm going to talk about are from the European side. So this is CE, so the FDA's cousin institution over there. They are similar in many respects and different in some. So I think some things will generalize to here, hopefully. So I found the process extremely device-centric. So the CE really likes machines that go bing and have a little flashing light. So this whole notion of software even, let alone anything data-driven and machine learned, was already pretty exotic to them. So, and for us working through, so we had a consulting agency that helped us with some of the certification process, and working even through those guide sheets, we found that a lot of these questions are just hard to answer just because they ask about a physical thing that you poke into the patient or that you strap the patient into, really not a thing that applies to an incorporeal entity such as software, right? So so a lot of these questions are around what's the harm that the product can cause the patient, and this is really how badly can the product electrocute the patient. So these categories don't easily apply to a lot of software. So it's always, for a lot of us, what will happen is, in the worst case, your software will spit out faulty, either information or combinations of information, and that may cause the physician then to do something that's maybe sub-ideal. Right. So that's tricky. The other one that we found tricky was if you come with something that's new, and a lot of AI applications will be new at the moment. And new here means there is no FDA or CE approved product already that does exactly what you want to do. You don't have this easy comparison. Are you as safe? Are you as effective as product A, as some drug, as some device that's already on the market? So you will not have that, which takes away a lot of this easy comparability of I buy the other box by the competitor, I do some testing, and I can then show that our box is as safe as the other box. So that was very tricky to us. So we tried to navigate that by doing a broader literature review to show more of the potential of these techniques in general domains, so not necessarily clinical. And then what we did, we had a pretty broad retrospective preclinical evidence to show that if you pretend that the stale data were current data and these were patients that would come in live now, what would happen? So in case of diagnostics, for example, if you have a lot of EHRs collected over the last few years, how good would you have been at diagnosing these people? And that worked for us, but that again is for the I guess for the lowest risk classes. So we're really here talking class 1A, 1B, depends a bit on the weather, risk class of CE device. So in class 2, clearly the world looks different.
Awesome. Jennifer or Kira, do either of you want to?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a close relationship with the FDA, and I don't totally understand the CE markings. It's been a nice, interesting learning experience. From my experience so far at the FDA is that the U.S. is committed. It's in the last few years, but definitely with the growth of the Digital Health Center of Excellence out of the FDA, and most recently their massive hires that they've started to undergo, probably starting in the last 2 years, really ramped up in the last year, and they have aggressive hiring targets to build out the FDA Digital Health Center of Excellence and create special platforms, but also federal and local initiatives to drive digital health. The US is, from what it seems like, clearly committed to really driving digital health solutions. Artificial intelligence is a piece of that, and that's a new piece. I've been impressed with their different divisions that are dedicated to it. For us specifically, we are going through a very specific regulatory pathway right now. The way that the FDA is structured is depending on how new your product is. You might get a 510K clearance, which, as Carsten alluded to, is based on something that's come through already. An existing medical device, existing maybe diagnostic. It's very well accepted, everyone knows. If you can kind of benchmark yourself against that, here's the typical evidence you give, here's the typical proof you give, boom, you're done. For AI, at least in the sector, and there's been some AI, fair amount of AI approvals, probably not a lot. Definitely in diagnostics, we would be new, which is exciting. They would, so far the feedback we've gotten is to suggest that this would be a brand new category, and we would go through a de novo type regulation, which is a pretty big lift, but also the first time that you would be creating a framework with the FDA as to what is the data they accept, how does that compare. There's the two major pieces as I see it, which is how do you take what you did in AI and then relate it to a clinical scenario, meaning however you set up the data, however you sliced it, however you set up the model, what actually replicates a real life clinical scenario that would do the same thing. And then also the clinical data that you would gather and what pieces can you relate and say, this is very clinically like similar. So there's the clinical scenario part, but then there's also the, at least for us, the technology regulation part. So whenever you're building software, and AIs have different complications for so many reasons, you have, how are you regulating that? How are you testing that? How are you making sure that they're saying they're doing what they're doing, but they're also going to, when they roll out, actually roll out the exact same thing? So we have the two pieces. I've been really impressed with the FDA so far. We have a dedicated artificial intelligence data guy who's evaluating us. So he does the whole, did they use a lot of data? Was the data appropriate? And did the model work? And then we actually have a dedicated clinical person who says, okay, we understand this is new. We might try to fit it into a few frameworks, but we understand that this might be building a totally different framework. This is what we have already. And I'm going to work with you to try to figure out what maps to what. So they've given us those 2 dedicated resources, and their expertise has been really good. So I've been very happy with our process so far. It seems like they're really dedicated to making AI happen and making sure the US is the leader in driving it.
We're going to get a little U.S. Israeli Swiss competition
I don't
going on here. I feel it already. And I just want to highlight, Jennifer, what you said about kind of that data side and the clinical side, and the fact that both are needed, and that you both need the scientific validity of the AI program and to consider kind of whether or not it's accurate. And then you need that clinical applicability. And so not just does this model work, but also does it work kind of from and we'll talk about this a little later in the panel, but does it work from a usability standpoint? Does it work from an ethical standpoint? What are the implications if it's a 99.9% accurate model, what are the implications of that 0.01%? And do we accept that from AI? And how does that differ from what we accept from us as humans? Because I know, Carsten, you and I have had discussions about how clinicians are not perfect either. And so kind of how do we compare the accuracy of the two? And I would actually love to hear Dr. Radinsky's thoughts here, because I know it's something she spent a lot of time thinking about with the triage questions about kind of how accurate are we as docs or nurses when we're triaging a patient versus how accurate is the AI model, and kind of how do you think about that difference there? And then I'm actually out of order going to pull in John, because I know he has thoughts about this too. So go ahead, Dr. Radinsky.
Sure thing. So first of all, we do have a predicate device, so we actually have to compare it to nurses, doctors. A lot of our testing can be done retrospectively, but we also do prospective testing. We're considered a decision support system, so eventually we need to show that our predictions are correct with a higher accuracy, and that nothing catastrophic actually happens, and actually follow up the guidelines that already there is several decision support systems, even in radiology, that we're following for the same guidelines. But touching to the point between retrospective and prospective, one of the things that we've experienced and seen that you can look at the distribution of what doctors are asking historically and documenting in the medical summary. For example, a doctor can document that a patient said this is their worst headache of their lives. But when you actually ask the patient using a digital system before meeting with the doctor, is this the worst headache of your life? Most people are going to answer yes, this is why I'm in the hospital. When the doctor is asking, they're asking additional questions, trying to verify this in different ways, and then writing their impression as well. So this piece is something that will never be inside of retrospective data. And we apply this prospective experience, we identify the difference in the distribution between what doctors are asking and documenting and what patients, when a digital system is asking them, is answering to it. There's a big difference. I'll give you an interesting number. 25% of the patients in our clinical trials that came with a chest pain said that the chest pain is radiating to their left side. If you compare it to what doctors are actually documenting, this should be less than 5%. And the reason is, again, maybe the subperception of the question, maybe this is what they worry about. And what we found out is that adapting those questions, so patients will actually answer them in the way that the doctor is answering them. This is what we've been doing in prospective trials. Give an example, we identified that for a headache, instead of asking, is this the worst headache, etc., just asking, is this like a hammer to your head? Is this like a lightning hitting your head? Right? So getting into metaphors, very similar to how a doctor would ask them, is the way to go, and then we see the distributions of the answers look similar.
That's awesome.
Fair. There's processing and translating that we do from like, oh, this is what they're saying. This is what I think they mean. And then this is what I'm writing down.
There is a 3-step translation there, yeah.
There's lots of,
And Kira, have you guys gone through any sort of FDA or CE certification process yet?
So we've done a few ones. So we've done the exemptions, HIPAA compliance, etc. For our 510K, we're still in a large clinical trial for 700,000 people in different clinical locations.
Any thoughts about that and how? Oh, did she freeze? No.
I'm listening.
Okay.
So thoughts, it's a process and you have to go through the process. We didn't find any hurdle or something that didn't make sense. It's something that just looks like good scientific work that needs to be done in order to show that it actually brings value and some security for the patients. So I wouldn't say that we're the first one who's doing a regulation for something that nobody has done before. Again, we're a decision support system, but there's additional decision support systems in different fields, and we're just following the guidelines. So unlike Jennifer, we didn't have to do a de novo in our case.
Fair, thank you. John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of that kind of twofold data, validating the data and the science versus validating it from a clinical perspective. I know, again, you have a slightly different perspective from your work around imaging.
Sure. Yeah, I think this was very interesting. Like I've never gone through an FDA process from the AI perspective, so I learned a lot from this. I mean, I do think the perspective versus retrospective question is very important. And I think in general, for me to believe, at least for high risk situations, in my opinion, things should be prospective and done within a controlled environment, like Dr. Radinsky was saying, to really, and that also includes pre-specification of the model. I think that is a way to get people, at least scientists, to build some trust in the product. And this is sort of emulating the clinical trial framework in general. As a second point, I think face validity is also pretty important for clinicians to actually, and patients to actually sort of want to build trust within those communities. If they can see that your model or your machine is sort of replicating a little bit of their processes, or seeing that they're using the same variables in some sense to make the decision, I think it's a much easier sell, I assume, to the clinician, rather than just telling them this is a black box, we don't know anything that's happening, and you believe it. I do think the sell becomes a lot easier when you actually have some face validity to this. So I think that's an important area of research and discussion in general. And the last, the last point is related to evaluation. I think measures of accuracy are sometimes somewhat misleading, in the sense that, like, doctors might be making the safe choice. They might think it's pretty unlikely to happen, but the safe sort of route to go is to say it might happen. So I do think you need to evaluate the model in a holistic sense, and understanding that some events are more dangerous than, like, some mistakes are worse than others, and understanding that these factors play a role in the decision making. So just saying that doctor or clinician makes this many mistakes might not be representative of actually how many mistakes, if their objective function was to make as few mistakes as possible, their mistakes might be a lot fewer. But their objective function might be optimized to make very few of these mistakes of a particular kind. So I do think how you structure the evaluation is very important. And I think giving a single measure is usually an insufficient way to go about it. I don't know how that plays in with the FDA's thought about it, but also my thoughts about how I sort of think about this.
No, I would love to dive into that a little deeper and hear the others' thoughts as well. And Thorn, I promise I'll come back to you about the FDA issue. But John, I think you raised a really important question, which it's almost like you need an anthropologist or sociologist to take a look at clinician behavior and decide which types of accuracy are the most important, what it is that you're solving for in a particular function. And I'll look, I think of Carsten's work as being on one side, where he's trying to help facilitate the diagnosis of rare diseases. And then I'll think of Kira's work as being on the other side. And again, talking about the triage work, where you don't want to miss anything that's bad. And so I'd love for us to kind of delve a little deeper into that question of how do you decide what your outcome measures are? There's the binary kind of way, there's the using AI to say it's a yes/no condition. It's sepsis, it's not sepsis. It's lung cancer, it's not lung cancer, right? So that's the binary. And then there's the comprehensive of here's the variety of things that it could be. And how do you make the decisions about which one you're going to look at? And then how, again, I know that you could teach an entire course on this, Carsten or John, but, and probably Kira as well. But how do you kind of make that decision making? And Jennifer, from your perspective in particular, I think something unique that you bring is that you're a clinician and a scientist, right? And so you kind of bring both of those perspectives to the table. And I know you represent, how do you use that clinical perspective to inform your company's decisions about which sort of outcome measure to bring? So I'll let whoever wants to jump in on this one.
Love to maybe say a few words. So I think evaluation is absolutely key, and it's very tricky to find the right measure, just because there might even be multiple amalgamated objectives that are sort of smushed into one thing that you would like your ideal solution to all satisfy. But I think at the core of the question is really it's almost the goal setting for your software. So is it indeed a binary outcome, or is it a continuum? Do you consider 2 or 10,000 possible diseases? What's really going on there? And I think the big fallacy that a lot of computer scientists certainly commit when entering, maybe not just the medical, but certainly any non-CS domain market, is we often start thinking about the world in terms of features, so stuff we can measure and observe about the world, and labels, these outcomes that we want to recognize and predict, right? So, and immediately you start thinking about, oh, this is the function that connects all these observations, and then eventually I get this binary or higher order outcome. But really, is that what matters? So often we try to solve tasks that are not even tasks. Or this is something that I see all the time in my even my very, very limited third-hand clinical experience, that people will write papers of how they got 99% accuracy on a task that nobody on earth will ever have. Just because the premise is completely off. The data that goes into their machinery will not be there because it can't be collected at the bedside. The thing that comes out is not useful. So we can't actually, even if we were 99% good at doing that, nobody would be able to do anything with it. So I think really crafting where you sit with this is really key. And then you have this question of, should I have binary outcomes or higher order outcomes? And there's unfortunately, there's a bit of a tug of war going on between, certainly if we do this in industrial settings, in startup settings, where your business case, the easier the better, right? So if you can break something down into binary, that's easier to understand for your investors. That's typically easier to place in a product workflow. So typically you'll have a business urge to make things simple. And at the same time, you might oversimplify the problem and actually start either limiting your impact or not solving an actual realistic problem need anymore. So it's really tricky, and I certainly don't have the answer to it, other than takes time.
I love that, the trivial versus the over-solving. Kira, John, Jennifer?
Yes, definitely. I'll touch on how we're doing the differential diagnosis space. Again, we're not claiming at any point that we're going to be replacing the doctor, but the point is, how can we be a better decision support system? So what we want the doctor to see is red flags. Red flags don't have to be for machine learning. There's many protocols that the doctor just needs to see a red flag, especially if we collect the data for the doctor asynchronously from the meeting of the doctor. And if there's a red flag, we just want to prioritize the patient high. Then we have our differential diagnosis. And again, the point of differential diagnosis, the doctors usually know the differential diagnosis. The point is to kind of prepare the patient to the doctor. So when they see the doctor, the patient has already all of the lab tests. And if there's any type of red flag that machine learning identified for bad diagnosis, we want to push them up so the doctor can really quickly scan through the medical summaries the system produces and say, yeah, I want to see this patient. This one that actually looks bad, right? So it's a lot about the presentation and how it can be used as a decision support system for the doctor. The next thing that we've noticed, and it a little bit touches on this point, is showing probabilities to doctors. In general, it's not, I can tell them, hey, it's 3% that the person has a heart attack. And it's like, but that person had a heart attack. Why did you say 3%? It's like, well, the prior chance is like 0.03. It's amazing, right? So what we identified is that the best way is not to always show the probability, but to actually show how much it multiplies the relative risk, right? So it's a lot of work of identifying how doctors that just don't have the time, they don't want to be math students to really understand what the model does behind the scene is, really quickly understanding kind of what are the diagnoses, what are we basing on? So it touches upon the fact that the machine learning model, there's nothing we can do, they're black boxes, right? But still, the doctors cannot use something which is black box. So we put a lot of effort on building machine learning models that can explain our machine learning models. So the doctor very quickly can push it and actually separate it into two lists. It's like scary diagnosis, hey, red flags, notice, and then what we most likely think that's gonna happen, and let the doctor decide what is the navigation flows, what they wanna automate, and what they wanna get attention at any point of time.
And
Yeah, there's just so much to say about this.
yeah, and Jen, as you talk about it, I'm actually going to also ask you to add in something like I think relevant here, kind of these ethical issues, you know, that. So go ahead.
So definitely, I'm more actively practicing physician than I am data scientist. I'm actively practicing in the ER, patients die on me fairly regularly. It's a top concern. And the whole, like, what am I optimizing for is very important. So I definitely think that one of my learning lessons with talking to more data scientists is there's a communication piece in terms of what you're doing for us. And you're right, like what you're doing in the clinical setting. And it has to be matched to the clinical setting, the clinician using it, the patient receiving it, the patient current plan of care, the patient future plan of care. And that's a lot of communication. And actually, it's more like a product management, but I think that our field hasn't seen yet. So in the ER, it's very much a pre-test probability, post-test probability. And that's what we're looking for in terms of a diagnostic test that's going to move the needle for us. And when you're creating a model, there's the concept of sensitivity and specificity, which doctors all have more or less. The concept of it is how many wrong positives are we going to get and how many wrong negatives are we going to get. What's fairly new, I think, from what I've taught data scientists is you have to dial one thing up or one thing down based on the use. So an example of that is PSAs. PSAs and Megan have a little bit of a dramatic history in the history of medicine. And that
you want to define, prostate specific antigen for those not a professional services agreement, but a prostate.
But it has a storied history with us in that it's a regular blood test we used to recommend for everyone. And we, based on the number, we'd say, you probably have cancer, you probably don't have cancer. We were aggressively looking at things and telling men that they had cancer. They didn't like the outcomes of pursuing that cancer because when you start manipulating the prostate, it has downstream effects that men feel very strongly about. And they will give a lot to not have those downstream effects. So we learned that, medical profession as a whole, and we're like, you know what? We have too many false positives, or prostate cancer in a lot of situations is just moving so slow that there's a lot of opportunity for retesting and identifying. So that's the whole dialing something up or down. This is a rare, strange place in that you are creating a model. So there's a lot of freedom to determine where you're going to set the sensitivity and specificity. What is brand new to the industry is you got to drop it into the clinical setting where it's the most appropriate. And that's, is this a high-risk patient or low-risk patient? And that's dependent on a lot of factors. So that was, I think, my one big learning of this. And I hope that helped.
That does. That's great. Thank you. John, I'll let you close out kind of this part of the discussion. I think this is a big area of your academic interest, right? So you let us off. I'll let you kind of close the loop here.
Yeah, definitely. So are you talking about the ethics component, or are you referring
to
can
you to go a little more detail in there?
Sure. I mean, I think like fairness of algorithms is becoming a very important topic, and I'm by no stretch of the imagination an expert on it, but I think people are becoming more and more aware of the fact that a lot of these algorithms have hidden biases, racial biases, gender biases, and so on. Like, I think there are pretty well-documented examples of those. Like, I think Alexa is less likely to detect the voice of a woman than it is of a man, and so on. Even though it doesn't understand my accent, but that's a different story. But in general, I think people have to be aware of the fact that artificial intelligence or machine learning or whatever you call it is for the most part a memorization tool. If there is bias in the data you have, they are going to replicate that bias unless you as an investigator tell the tool to act differently. So if there is systematic bias in the data that is used to train the model is going to replicate those biases. And if you want to act on that, you actually have to be conscious of that, and you have to actually tell the model what to do it. So I think it's very important in general, as a lot of these models and algorithms are built on sort of data in non-controlled environments. And in my opinion, when I start a project and when I talk to people, like the first question I ask is, where does the data come from? How is the data sampled? Because I think people have a tendency to focus on data quantity. How much data do you have, rather than data quality of them, in the sense that often, like electronic health records, I think is a primary example of data. Like, there's a lot of data, but there's also a lot of problems with that data in many ways. There is ethical, like there is measurement error, there is missing data, there are sampling biases, there is selection biases who gets certain type of healthcare and so on. So I think in order to make meaningful progress in this area, you actually have to understand where the data comes from. That was the first point. The second point is a problem I also see all the time, in the sense of when people are doing prediction, what they actually want to do is doing a causal prediction. What would have happened if the system worked in a different way than it works? And that's a completely different question. Like, and I think I think a lot of the failures actually of machine learning in the healthcare space have come from the fact that people are not sort of distinguishing between prediction and causal predictions. That is, I want to predict what happens if everyone in my system gets treated for prostate cancer, versus predicting if everyone in the system does not get treated for prostate cancer. And that's a completely different question than trying to predict what happens among the subset of people who get prostate cancer. So I think having those, keeping those things in mind is definitely something that I think is very, very important.
Okay, so this explains my disappointing relationship with Alexa. This is new information. Alexa is not living up to my standard.
Oh, same here, accents are killer.
Which is just then such an important comment for us in healthcare, right? And I do think that we take these things on as an academic challenge of let's solve for this problem, and forget that when we actually are deploying it, that we have to deal with a wide variety, not have to, we should, and will therefore be required to deal with a wide variety of patients who come from a variety of different backgrounds, as well as a wide variety of clinicians. And the side to that is not just, this is an issue of deep interest to me, but so the side to that is not just the kind of issues with the data that we're gathering and the data that we're analyzing, but also the differences in the clinical practice where we're going to roll this out, which is then the next question that I actually want to talk about is how do you kind of bake into the development process, and we've skirted around it, but how do you bake into the development process that clinician or end user engagement that minimizes the ethical issues and helps you identify what those right outcome measures are? Because again, if I think about COVID treatments, what I'm developing or implementing at Rhode Island Hospital and the Miriam, which are tertiary care centers here in Rhode Island, are going to be very different from what are feasible to my colleagues who are working at a critical access hospital in Idaho. And so it's kind of thinking through who those users are is just a critical part of the development process and can inform a lot of the decisions you're making. So from each of your perspective, how have you gone about making sure that that end user, whether it's a clinician or a patient, is involved in some way in those key development decisions that we've been talking about?
I can start. So I actually want to draw attention for a lot of the proactive work that has been done here. So for example, when you're looking, for example, on claim data or historical medical records and trying to predict if in 6 months a patient will deteriorate, this is a very well-known practice done by a lot of care management. So a year ago, there was a very nice paper published exactly about that when race was used as one of the parameters. So it wasn't used implicitly. Okay, so what they actually used was cost, and they identified that patients that are expensive this year, it actually increases probability they're going to be expensive next year as well, right? The problem is when they actually did matching and looked at the patients from different races, we had this bias before that, for example, certain races have been receiving less healthcare versus the ones that were receiving the same one. So patients with the same clinical outcomes, one would be recommended by the system, and the other one would not, just because they had different costs in the past. So the things that we'll be doing, so first of all, we need to be aware of this. This is part of the task that we need to do before deploying those models in practice. It's not so hard mathematically to do it, so you just catch them and look at different gender bias, race bias, etc., and make sure that patients that are matched from two different races, the system predicts very similar predictions for them. And I think we need to think about the different protocols of what it means to be an approved machine learning model, which is not biased. So everybody knows those practices, not everybody's following them before going to production, especially, for example, the simplest thing is just don't put cost into the model. The main problem is that it reduces the precision of the model, which is just fine as long as it's not a racist model.
That is the worst case scenario.
So, Megan, I hear and respect you, and I think it's really important to discuss. Using technology to decrease healthcare disparities is near and dear to my heart. I'm from Mississippi, so it's the poorest area of the United States, and it's also the heart of some of the most recognized highest intensity discrimination, especially in the healthcare system. And I was one of the early researchers on the Jackson Heart Study. So it was our first epidemiological attempt to actually look at race as a major factor in anything in healthcare. So I was one of the very early publishers. It's very important. So I think that's very important to consider in general, and there's an opportunity here to decrease bias and disparities, and those need to be explored a little bit more. I will say it's important to tailor whatever you're producing to your outcome. So it's been a learning experience for me and my team. They've had such a learning experience that what they've decided to do is that we have our model, but we also have the data that we typically use. One of their big learning experiences was, you're right. When you first build a model and you don't know anything about the clinical scenario, they're like, we have a whole massive database, and I'm going to use blood data, and I'm going to use vitals data, and I might use what the doctor says, and I might use what the patient said. And based on all of that, because the data is here, because this is a massive database, I can get this accuracy or area under the curve. And they get really excited about it. And they start showing it to a doctor, and they're like, well, we don't capture that. Or blood pressure's all over the place. So how are you going to, I just can't trust that your blood pressure that you used here is going to apply here. And then I'm controlling for how you captured that blood pressure and then capturing it again in this clinical scenario. It's just a no-go. We're not even going to have the discussion. So we actually had that learning experience. We, based on that, took out all of those harder to control factors, which is what doctors write, what patients say, and vitals are all very unpredictable. And we were like, blood tests are fairly reliable. There's still a lot that you need to do to blood test to ensure that what you captured is actually what you're going to capture in the future. So that's what our big learning lesson was. Another big learning lesson was to our data team was, when are you actually doing something useful for the patient or the clinician? Is that a new diagnostic test? Is it an old diagnostic test? Is it a better diagnostic test? If you're making it slightly better, we could care less because this thing's already working. So slightly better is not going to move the needle. In general, are you going to create a new diagnostic test? That's interesting. Except now you have to sell me on the value proposition of a new diagnostic test. And I don't really care if I can't do anything about it, because then that's going to make me anxious. It's going to make the patient anxious. We're all going to be anxious. So one of our so having the clinical, what we've learned is running the scenario early by the clinician and hearing from the clinician what would move the needle, what's important, what's just like clinically like very unrealistic to ever drop into our workflow. Maybe you shouldn't pursue that. See if you can take that out of the data. What we're pursuing is my data team is going to set up a platform apparently where they're going to make it easy, they said, for Dr. Joe to go into a dashboard and say, here's your data, Dr. Joe, just go and play with it. If you're looking at trying to do better with heart failure, what would you see as an easy thing, and start looking for patterns. So that's my data team's proposal of how they're going to incorporate the clinical view. And outside of clearly having clinician input early on, I think is useful.
Awesome. I'm going to actually have us kind of move on, just because I know we only have a few more minutes in this portion of kind of the me moderated Q&A before we go on to the excellent questions that have been asked by our attendees. And I just want to kind of, again, but I want to put a highlight on this for the folks in the audience who are more on the computer science or entrepreneurial side, which is bringing that clinical input in early, as you've heard from everyone, is critical, both to defining the outcomes and to making sure that the way that you're analyzing and presenting the outcomes is done, again, in a way that matters. I would love to talk about how you all mitigate or I'm not going to say eliminate bias, but rather mitigate bias in your models, but maybe we can touch on that in the audience-led Q&A. What I'd actually love to end with for this part of the panel is just a very quick going around, and Thorn, I'd love to hear your thought here too, is if you're comfortable sharing your thoughts on where business models lie within AI. It's a tough question, right? So for folks, you know, this is co-hosted by a venture fund, and their question is, well, where are you going to make the money, right? What's going to be the sustain? This is not being done as a public good. You have to pay your staff and get it out there. So I'd love to hear just a very quick round robin on thoughts on business models for AI in the healthcare space. Thorin, you want to start?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. A couple of the speakers talked about how the tools have to make life easier for the physician, because in the end, a lot of them will end up being pieces of decision support. And if I think about how computing in general is going to impact medicine, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in just things that save time or make just make life easier for those providing it. And I think if you stick with things like that, that those things will be chosen by users. And in this case, I'm thinking mostly of doctors. And as we also heard before, some things, you know, doctors, I've had experiences where they just like the way they used to do it. So they don't really want to do the new thing, no matter how novel you point
You
out.
don't like doctors. We're difficult. We can be difficult.
Didn't say I didn't like them. As a matter of fact, I'm just trying to save time for them. So, I mean, I think that business models that have a real meat and potatoes value proposition, like helping doctors or saving time, that's a good place to place a bet.
Ours are clear. We're medical diagnostic, CPT codes, or, you know, however CPT codes would be treated.
Yeah, no, it's clearly anything that saves time, because time is expensive in this. It's a scarce resource, so you have doctors already on the brink of burnout. So you clearly want them to push them in the right direction, not over the cliff. And the other one is anything that's really in the unfortunately, I have to say, but fact of the matter is in the billing, value generating part of the pipeline. So can you suggest the right diagnostic test, for example? That's probably going to be more profitable than saying here's a differential.
Kira?
So in our case, we actually fall under primary care and work very closely with health plans. A lot of the work that we're doing is how can we optimize for the right medical setting for the patient? besides the fact that patients just do not need to go to the emergency department for everything small, it's actually not the best clinical treatment for them. It creates a lot of the loads on the healthcare system, but even from a price perspective, this is staggering. An emergency department visits can cost $1,500 as compared to even the most expensive place in primary care, like $150. So in the US alone, there's $200 billion spent in vain because of unavoidable emergency department visits that could have been handled in primary care and actually clinically more suited for the patient. 70% of the emergency department visits, and again, the number varies depending on the study you look at, but in the US, it's somewhere between 70 to 90%. In Europe, they're discussing somewhere between 25 to 35% of emergency department visits could have been handled in primary care. So a lot of the work that we're doing is around the medical setting navigation and identifying the right physical treatment with the right care and the right price.
Awesome, thank you. So a variety of different ways to approach the business model. I'm going to ask one final question of our panel before we go to the Q&A. John, knowing that you're not actively involved with a startup at this point at least, do you see there being an ethical issue associated with substituting AI? And I know some of you had said you're not substituting, you're augmenting, but substituting AI for human-led diagnosis based on cost considerations. How do you kind of approach that?
I mean, it's always a tough question. It's almost an impossible to answer question, to be completely honest, in the sense that how much is a life worth? Like, people put very different, like no one is willing to answer that, but in the decision process, we are really putting a number on a life, like a dollars amount on a life in some sense. So, and I think, so that alone makes the question really, really hard. But I think in general, I think, again, I go back to the prospective evaluation of the need for that, to do it in a controlled environment where like patient advocates, clinicians, and everyone is involved in the process from the beginning, both to build trust and I think just to be able to sort of convince people of using it, at least in high stakes applications. I think this is a little bit different in lower stakes application. So, like for example, the question, should you be analyzing images? Like, so should you be making the AI analyze 99% of the images and then flagging the last 1% for further review? I think it just depends on the clinical setting. In a lot of cases, I think it's hard to give a general answer. Like, what are the consequences of a mistake? That plays a huge role in the ethics of it. What is the cost? If you are overburdening doctors with giving them more images, does that mean they make more mistakes? So there are trade-offs all along the way, and I think this is really an impossible question to answer unless you are talking about a very specific area. So I think it has to be answered on sort of an area-specific basis, to give you a very vague answer. Apologies for that.
No, that's, I think that you raise important points for our seminar listeners to think about. And the thing that I'll add in there is that you talk about the location, and as someone who's worked in global health, I also want to make sure that we're not offering kind of substandard solutions to folks in lower resourced settings, which is something that we do think about. Carsten, it looks like you have a point there, and then I do want to get to our Q&A.
Yeah,
so go
yeah.
ahead.
So I think the somewhat cynical answer to the question of ethical concerns here that I'd like to bring is, what's the ethical concern with having people be treated by fellows? Right? So what's with inexperienced doctors? Right? Yeah. So we see these studies all over the place. I mean, these AI versus doctor, typically there's a spectrum, right? So you have people that are very good, that have a sharp day. You have, everyone's human, we make mistakes. And you, by and large, the rule seems to be you learn with experience, and the longer you do things, the better you get at that. So what's the ethical concern with letting someone inexperienced human being treat humans? And that's exactly the same, and nobody ever raises that question. So it's, I think at the end of the day, we really have to think about these things as tools, not replacements. And to me, it would be unethical to not use these tools.
I love it. That's a great way to finish this section. Thank you, Carsten. So I'm going to go into the audience Q&A now. I am going to call out the names of people. We're going to do our best to get through all the questions. There have been a bunch of them that have come in. What I'm going to do is I'll call out your name, and Leah Salzano, who's our administrative assistant from the center, will unmute you at the point when I call your name, and I'll let you read your question. To my panelists, I'm going to ask you if kind of one person can take, I'll let you guys kind of, whoever jumps in, if one person can take the lead on each question, and if the others have thoughts, to offer them briefly, but knowing that we only have about 20 minutes left, I'd like to get through as many cues as possible. So first, Camille White, if you could do just a one-sentence introduction of who you are and then ask your question.
Hi, my name is Dr. Camille White. I have a significant background working in electronic medical records for the Department of Defense, the Veterans Health Administration, Cerner Corporation, and also with the National Institutes of Health for their All of Us research program in precision medicine. So my question was, there's been a lot of conversation in the news about health algorithms biased against people of color, Black people. Wondering, has there been any discussion around artificial intelligence and machine learning applied to health equity and social determinants of health in the clinical or research environment?
So really respect the work you're doing and respect your work at the VA. I'm a practicing clinician at the VA, and also Biocogniv does have some NIH funding for our work. So it's very much an important part. There is a lot of attention to it. I know a good friend of mine has a specific grant to look at that. From the Biocogniv side, right now we're in the research, we're developing the model. We are lucky in that we have one of the largest COVID databases out there, potentially the largest for our first diagnostic. That was very important for us. We have potentially the largest group of people of color in our set. So we might actually be like the most we looked at that in our data from what we know of how we compared to other tests that were developed. We took it into consideration. We looked at the sensitivity specifically for it. And then I agree, there's a few other important pieces, which is how it's rolled out to people of color. Meaning, is this going to work within their particular scenario? So I grew up in a very low resource place. I worked at Jackson Free Clinic, I built it up. What can you realistically do? And then people of color, especially if they're getting COVID testing, they can't sit and wait for, or the impact for sitting and waiting for a test to come back for 2 days, 4 days, 10 days. It's a larger impact. Then there's also, respect to the different cultures and making sure that whatever you're doing within that different culture is respectful to them. That might be for vets. They have different ways that they like to interact, that they like to receive care. That might end, I don't want us to fall into the mistake that all people of color are the same either. And it's definitely like a relationship between the person, the provider, and also the scenario. But I think monitoring how whatever is produced, where it's rolled out, how it's rolled out, and tracking the numbers and making sure it works. You can track the numbers either in the accuracy, but also in the uptake. And I think what's underrepresented is what the patient thinks, how they appreciated it, how it did or did not change them, and if it worked. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. And then the last thing that I will add in too is kind of that consideration of both the explicit versus the implicit categories. And I think that there's a great potential as well for us to use ML in both ways, both to identify the unseen and to help break down things that we have taken as categories that are largely societally created. Camille, thank you for that thoughtful question.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Thanks. Look forward to staying in touch. Next question is going to be from Richie Bavasso. I'll let Leah find Richie and invite him in.
Okay, great. Thank you, Thorne, for inviting us. I'm also a native Rhode Islander, so I'm very supportive of everything that he's doing and that's happening in our great state. That's a tough question about this audience. NQ Medical, I'm the CEO and founder of this company. We're a computational biomarker discovery program that uses passive data collection to detect disease early, track disease progression over time, and show the impact of therapy, primarily focused on disorders of motor and cognition. So that's who we are. And as I look at the marketplace and I look at what's happened with COVID, COVID is, of course, disastrous across our country, but it's also been positive in terms of shedding light on the need for virtual care. And, you know, all this discussion is driving in some version of virtual care. So my question is this: you could have the greatest technology in the world with the most highest level of science, validation, and regulatory clearance, and sit on a shelf and never be used because physician adoption is extremely difficult. People adoption, I wouldn't even say patient adoption, people adoption is challenging with all the adherence issues that we deal with every single day. So I'm just looking for insight from the panel as to that insurmountable or seemingly insurmountable task of getting clinicians to change their behavior and getting patients to making an investment in their own health.
Yeah, it's clearly an uphill battle, but I think one interesting enabling factor, let's say, that we've been seeing helps with just getting people invested and with helping convince people is this ability of explainability, and John sort of touched on that earlier, right? So in order to first of all figure out biases, but also to get buy-in from whomever might be the stakeholders, could be patients, could be physicians. It tends to be across the board, even if we are talking Amazon recommendations for products, but also diagnostic recommendations or patient routing recommendations of whom should this person see. The ability to explain why that is seems to be key. And that's not by itself the recipe for solving this whole thing, but I think if you have a machine learning system that is unable to explain itself and say, well, that diagnosis because these 3 biomarkers and maybe that statement that the original physician wrote, you'll have a very, very hard time getting adoption, no matter how good the system is.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I'll highlight here as well that this is kind of where I think behavioral science comes in, kind of going back to, we talked about clinicians, that you need to include clinicians from the get-go. And I'll say that we also need to include those basic theories of behavioral change, that you need both the great outcome, the appropriate outcomes, and the good science, and the clinical value. And then I love that you asked that question, Ricky. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richie. I appreciate it. I'm going to move to our next question, again, just for the sake of time, because we have so many great ones. Adil Abbasi.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adil Abbasi. I'm an ED physician and a medical intensivist here at Brown, and an early career researcher hoping to use AI to improve patient outcomes in the ICU. My question involves the challenge of data acquisition for not just research, but clinical use, which I think limits the promise of AI, at least in the near future. How do we convince healthcare systems and EHR companies, which have their own commercial and financial obligations, to help us make clinical data more accessible for research?
The $1,000,000 question. Who wants to take this one? Dr. Radinsky, you've had tremendous success. You want to talk about kind of your strategies?
Right, just making sure that the question is, how do we obtain data that different health systems have obtained in order to perform much deeper clinical trials? Is this the question?
Yes, healthcare systems and EHR companies that make it the process very convoluted and outright impossible sometimes.
Right. So there's no magic solution, right? Usually you work through different business partnerships and obtain access to some of this data. And then you actually get to the challenge of how you unite all of these large data sets. Each one of them is collected in a completely different way, with completely different fields, with completely different protocols, and how you make the unified machine learning model that can be deployed for all. There's a lot of benefit. For example, in the Israel ecosystem, all of the HMOs have to report their data to a single entity, to the Ministry of Health, which then enables that no matter to which hospital you're invited, to any emergency department, the physician that's in emergency department will always see your primary care data, no matter from where you came from. It was a large governmental project. So coming to the question, it has to be a centralized entity, which is external, objective, doesn't see the data. So it's, they call it a Snapchat of medical records, right? The primary care doesn't want the hospital to actually see it. Only for treating the patients is not passing to everybody else. So it's building the incentive package around this, but we're considered today this third party company that can collect this data and only use this for the clinical treatment of patients. So back to your question, eventually incentives, identifying a third body and getting somebody who's really much involved in this, like a Ministry of Health, a governmental agency, to actually start regulating some of these processes for the benefit of all.
Thank you.
The other possibility, so that's the stick, right? So Kira described the stick, force everyone to share and force them to adhere to standards, which is awesome, and I think we need the stick. The carrot here might be trying to emphasize what the value of data is. And that sort of tries to encourage people to actually write it down in the first place, because we see a lot of stuff that's simply lost. It's either lost somewhere in the depths of Epic, or it's lost because we never really recorded it, right? So I think that's something that more and more hospital systems now realize and see, that if I have data keeping for research purposes as well as for say product development purposes, that is worth something. It is literally worth gold, and I just have to stop throwing the gold out of the window, right? So, and that's, I think there needs to be a combination of these two. So there needs to be some form of compulsion to make sure that we are willing to collaborate, and then there has to be this realization of I should keep this stuff and make sure that it's usable.
And for us, the NIH has been really good about getting more data sets. And then there's a federal-wide initiative to be better about de-identifying data in these crazy data scientific ways that goes far beyond my knowledge, so that data can be shared more broadly. So federal government initiatives have really supported it.
Thank you.
On the other side, I would say we have to be somewhat careful about making data publicly available, because these are actually individuals behind these data points. So if that, I think when people say de-identifiable data, but there has been some research showing that you can actually identify individuals much easier than a lot of people think.
Yes, like the concept of differential privacy, where you take everything out. So when I call it de-identify, yes, it implies taking out birth date and name, but you actually take it all the way out.
I also think if we make, I think mistakes are somewhat costly in this space, in the sense that if you make one big mistake that gets a lot of headlines, I think that could set the field back tremendously. So I do think it's, in my opinion, a wise thing to take somewhat of a conservative approach to it. I don't know exactly where the balance is, but I do think there are important sort of ethical, privacy-related issues that are still to be solved.
And they are dependent on the modality of the data as well.
Of course.
Right? So text is a nightmare to de-identify, because you just don't know what people write in there. And the moment you miss it once, it's done.
Sure. I think all questions go back to subject-specific knowledge matters a lot. So it's very hard to talk on broad basis, but I agree with you.
And I also just want to add in there, since this is a business-focused discussion, that there's also some ethical concerns around using patient data without their consent to create a business. For those, when I give lectures to my students, I'll often talk about the Henrietta Lacks story. For those who don't know it, the HeLa cell line was a cell line taken from cervical cancer from a Black woman who lived in the South that has been used for innumerable amazing discoveries in medicine, but was done entirely without her consent. And there have been a couple of big stories, to John's point, in the last year or two around health systems using patient data without patient consent, basically in order to enrich a few founders or the health system, with Memorial Sloan Kettering's work with pathology slides on cancer being kind of one of the biggest examples recently. So Adil, not an easy answer for you, unfortunately. The last thing I'll add is, of course, gathering the data costs money. And so for those health systems, they may have it all in the EHR, but it's still expensive to extract it, and then again to create either a limited or fully de-identified data set. I think we're going to have time for one more question, and for this one I'm going to do this for one of our students, it looks like, Moritz Steinrucki. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your last name correctly.
Hi, I'm Moritz. Thanks very much for putting this on. I'm a medical student at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And I was wondering if any of you have any advice to medical students that want to get more involved in coding and AI, specifically in healthcare, kind of once after becoming familiar with the basics of programming.
I think there is no shortage of opportunities in some sense. Like it's more about what you should not do. If you Google things, it's more about finding the correct information rather than lack of information, for sure. And I assume almost all universities offer courses in programming and related activities, computer science department, statistics department, and so on. So I would envision there's not a shortage of those. But I also think you learn a lot by doing. Like you can find the problem you're interested in and just play around with it and start coding that way. I think that's also a very good way to incentivize and keep your enthusiasm up. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe one thing. So the only thing that I do see go wrong once in a while is I guess just blindly playing around with tools without really understanding the methodology, right? So it doesn't really matter if the last proof is maybe not clear of every latest deep learning system, but I think this general setup of why do I need separate training, validation, and test data? What can I and can I not do with these, and how do I measure performance in a way and so that I don't lie to myself, right? So these things are important, and I think that's what sometimes we get wrong if we just try to replicate the latest 3 Medium posts. But yeah, other than that, I mean, this is the age to do it. There's so much awesome material out there, and it has never been easier to get started.
I completely agree with that. If you don't do that, I think you become dangerous in some sense. If you don't understand the principles behind it, I think that's yeah.
And I'll put in my plug for linking up with a group of great faculty who can help mentor you through that. And I'll say, kind of from my perspective, and I think Carsten and John can add on to this, that you want to find a faculty member where you can work on a project that's of direct relevance to them, because you're going to get much better mentorship. If you come to John and say, I want to work on AI for imaging, you're going to get much better mentorship than if you come to him and say, I want to work on it for HIV diagnosis, for example. And for Carsten, you're going to get a lot more if you say that you're going for long tail diagnostics than if you say that you want to do the type of stuff that Jennifer is doing. So finding faculty members and being willing to work on their projects. The other thing is to say that you can work on it both from the CS side and from the clinical side. And so take a look around and be willing to follow the leads. With that, I know we only have 5 minutes left. Thorn, would you like to close out with a few comments from your perspective from Slater, which has been such a big supporter here in Rhode Island?
Yeah, so this has been a terrific session, and I hope we have more of them in even deeper topics. I would echo that the computing, I think we're in the golden age of the cutting edge of computing and medicine. And sometimes I think that we maybe value privacy too much if there's so much greater good out there that comes out of having data in the hands of these data scientists. But I think it's a great time to be studying in this area, a great time to be attacking hard problems. And I hope that everyone here will send an email to the Slater Fund when you get your teeth into a project like this. And thank you to Megan for doing such great monitoring.
Totally my pleasure. Well, I want to thank all 4 of our panelists and of course Slater for partnering in this. For those who haven't joined us with the Center for Digital Health before, we do offer seminars on an almost weekly basis. They range from the very local research in progress to chances to be introduced to local businesses, to things like this, which hopefully just expand all of our thought processes around what is possible within the field. I'll say to anyone who's on the seminar who's interested in either speaking or being linked to Center for Digital Health, certainly feel free to reach out to us. You can look at our website through Brown and find our email there. We're active on Twitter as well. And most of all, I want to thank the panelists. Really kind of your 4 very varied areas of expertise are what made this super interesting. I know that I learned a ton despite spending an awful lot of time thinking and working in this area. And I'm hopeful that this will lead to future collaborations and to ventures being brought to Slater, because again, it's the money that makes the mission possible. So we're excited to have them here and to have these partnerships in place. With that, unless you have final comments, I'll close out and look forward to seeing many of you at our next seminar. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everybody.